Sega of America was making some bold moves in the 90s regarding the direction of their company, and a lot of their choices worked. However, some of their choices clearly didn't, and it affected more than just Sega. It was affecting stakeholders like the company Working Designs. This is the story of Working Designs and Sega's sinking ship. In 1989, Sega released the Sega Genesis. In the US market, with the help of some excellent marketing, Sega absolutely thrived, holding its own against the giant that was Nintendo at the time. I mean, after all, Sega managed to wrestle Nintendo out of a 90% market share.
Oh yeah, I'm coming for you, Nintendo. I'm gonna rise to the top.
In order to keep up with the technology of the time and attempt to be competitive, both Nintendo and Sega started looking to the future with CD technology. Nintendo's story with CD tech is pretty famous by now, but hey, that's another video. Sega went with the Sega CD, making it the second system to adopt CD technology. This is of course after NEC with the Turbo CD or the TurboGrafx CD. So why is this a problem? Doesn't it seem like a good idea to be on the bleeding edge of technology if you're a video game company? Wouldn't that be smart? Well, not particularly in this case. The Sega CD, while a neat piece of hardware, was sort of like doomed from the beginning. As an attachment, it required of people not only to have the original hardware already purchased, which was nearly $200, but also to buy an expensive add-on for an additional $300 when it launched. Holy moly, that's a lot of money. $500, which is potentially what one could have spent on the Sega CD and Genesis at the time, not accounting for taxes. That would be nearly $1,200 today. That's pretty similar to the cost of the PS5 and a PSVR 2 together, which isn't selling particularly well either right now. In for a dime, in for a dollar, I suppose. And this is what we get for being early adopters of technology, right? The parts were simply expensive for the time, but that wasn't the only issue at hand here. Sega of Japan was afraid that people would leak the news of the Sega CD and details, so they were extremely tight-lipped about it, even to their partners at Sega of America. That's pretty paranoid. You won't even tell your coworkers or whatever about it because you're afraid somebody's going to leak it. I get it. That happens in the industry, but that was kind of a problem. That caused some issues here. It's reported in several places across the internet that Sega of America sort of had to Frankenstein one, putting it together themselves to see what it would do. Also, because of this, Sega was incredibly slow about getting development kits out to its developers. When companies do this, it doesn't give developers adequate time to make good software in preparation for a launch, often having to rush to make sure they have something available for the launch of a new system. Because of this, the Sega CD had absolutely crap software available out the door. And crap software was probably the biggest problem with the Sega CD. But what about Sonic CD? What about Night Trap, right? Well, the new CD format created by Sony and Philips provided a huge storage capacity for information over the cartridges of the consoles of its day. To put this in perspective, a CD could hold the top 20 Super Nintendo games and the top 20 Sega Genesis games all at the same time on there. So with all this potential, what should we put on the Sega CD?
Welcome to the sewers, punk. The guy you're replacing? He had that same tough guy smirk on his face that you do, till he hit the wall.
FMV, absolutely brilliant. To be fair though, I have kind of a soft spot for FMV. I thought it was incredible back in the day to see real people in a video game. And of course, to think that my home console could play Dragon's Lair was just mind-boggling to me. The industry and fans alike have relegated FMV to the back of the line in terms of importance for video games now. But it was, at the very least, impressive to see back in the day, even if it wasn't that fun to play. This was the problem with the software for the Sega CD. Everyone seemed to be focusing on making FMV video games, or focusing on FMV for video games, or, given the time crunch, making ports of older video games and slapping a CD soundtrack on there with a few FMV scenes. But what should we expect when Sega was so slow to get development kits into the hands of developers? It's much easier to just add enhancements to an already existing video game. That's just truth. And so that's what many companies did. What the Sega CD got then was truly few quality games and a lot of underwhelming entries. So a lot of systems today have some crappy games. What's the big deal, right? Like, why? Why is this important? Well, these low quality, these crappy, low effort games, or shovelware as many have come to call it, are a sign of a healthy system, right? If a system is doing well, everybody wants a piece of that pie. So many answer the call of Gondor.
Good knuckles for 8.
And Rohan will answer.
However, the Sega CD was not a healthy system. Oh no. Unfortunately, the vast majority of games on the Sega CD were, well, there were just over 200 games for the Sega CD. And to give you some perspective, the contemporaries for the Sega CD, the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, each had over 1,000 games. Super Nintendo nearly 2,000 games. Now, if only like 10% of games are quality for a system, and that's a completely arbitrary number I've made up, but it kind of fits, I think. The Genesis had about 100 good games, and the Super Nintendo had about 170 good games. With a library of 200, that's 20 good games for the Sega CD. The trouble is that many would argue that the Sega CD didn't even have 20 good games. While slightly subjective, many would argue that these are the good games. These are a few of the good games for the Sega CD. Sonic CD. Night Trap. Snatcher.
Gillian's fine, and you can call me Gillian, Mika.
Final Fight. Shining Force CD. Lunar, the Silver Star. Lunar, Eternal Blue. Popful Mel. They. See, these games are the standouts on the system, but when you look at it, 4 of those games are from one publishing company, Working Designs. Lunar, the Silver Star, Lunar, Eternal Blue, Popful Mel, and Vey were all published by Working Designs and made up a solid percentage of the best received games and the best selling games on the Sega CD. So you would think that things were going pretty well for Working Designs and the Sega CD relationship, right? Well, sort of, and sort of not. While RPGs were not the most popular form of video game entertainment in the industry at the time, the sales of these games were, of course, like any other game, limited by the number of systems that were sold. Take a moment and think about that. You can't sell more games than people have systems, and the Sega CD did not sell that well. The Sega CD sold a little over 2 million systems in the world, so regardless of how well received a game might be, it's still not going to outsell the number of systems sold. This in mind, Working Designs was, at least for these games, riding a sinking ship that was the Sega CD. Let's get some brief context. Who is Working Designs? Working Designs was a video game publisher and developer founded in 1986 and led by Victor Ireland. The company was known for localizing Japanese role-playing games, JRPGs, whatever, and bringing them to North America. They gained a reputation for their high-quality translations and their elaborate packaging, and yes, it is awesome. It's so good. It's just so good. A moment of praise. In the early years, Working Designs published titles for platforms like the Sega CD and TurboGrafx. Their major breakthrough game, funny enough, came with the release of Lunar, the Silver Star, and Lunar Eternal Blue for the Sega CD, which became absolute cult classics. These games are awesome. Please check them out. I have a video about Lunar. I don't want to link it here because I'm going to link some other video, but there's a video I have about Lunar, how it's wonderful. Check it out if you get a chance. Or somebody's video. Just appreciate it. During the 90s, the company shifted to Sony's PlayStation, where they continued to release popular RPGs such as Ark the Lad and Alundra. Despite their success in the niche market, Working Designs faced a lot of challenges, including delays and high production cost. In 2005, Working Designs closed its doors, with Victor Ireland going on to found Gaijinworks, another game localization company. Working Designs remains fondly remembered by its fans for its dedication to quality and the just absolute awesome humor and translations and personality that they brought to their games. Typically, if you were a console RPG fan, you are a Working Designs fan. Working Designs became well known for its work on Sega CD titles, right? They localized Lunar the Silver Star and Lunar Eternal Blue, which were critical and commercial successes. These games were and still are celebrated for their awesome stories, memorable characters, and high-quality translations, albeit sometimes goofy translations. If you're into this sort of story and content, this is not a paid advertisement, this is not a sponsored video, but it's a friendly recommendation. If you haven't tried Audible, you should check it out. I have a ton of audiobooks that I listen to on Audible, on drives when I get a moment to relax, whenever. And there's plenty on there about video game history. I particularly recommend Service Games, The Rise and Fall of Sega by Sam Pettis. It's great, and it details so much about Sega's history. In the description below, you'll find a trial for Audible and a link to Service Games, and if you want to check that out, I highly recommend it. I'm not a sponsor, but full disclosure, if you do the whole thing, if you do the trial or whatever, I think I get $5. So you're supporting me with that, and it's not me being sneaky. Full disclosure, I can make $5. That's exciting. Woo! This is something I can authentically recommend to you because I've been using Audible for like 6 years now or so. I think when I looked, I have 12 credits left and I have 60 audiobooks on there, so I think that's 72, so yes, 6 years. Again, this is not sponsored by Audible, but I could make some money if you click on the link and do a trial or whatever. But if you go to, consider using my link. If not, whatever, it's cool. Through its meticulous localization process, Working Designs helped Sega's reputation among RPG fans in North America. Working Designs, the company, was known for its perfectionism, which sometimes led to extended development times. But it made them fan favorites because they were bringing us these games that had not been localized in the US and were injecting the market with some much needed quality RPGs. So, needless to say, this company had its own hurdles to jump, but one of the biggest hurdles was the failing popularity and support for the Sega CD. The ship started sinking. This is that moment in the Titanic where it's like, oh, I assure you, this ship will sink. She's made of steel or whatever. She will sink.
But this ship can't sink.
She's made of iron, sir. I assure you, she can. And she will.
The Sega CD launched in the United States in 1992 and sales already started slumping in 1993 with the release of the 3DO, a failure in itself, but a technically superior failure nevertheless. Before the year was out, news outlets began reporting that Sega was no longer interested in taking proposals for games for the Sega CD. That's a year? 1 year? That's pretty sloppy. That's not really, dedicated to your buyer base. By the end of 1994, almost every Sega CD that would be sold had been sold. Yet, Working Designs just kept chugging along.
Chicka, 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 toot, toot.
And things, well, they didn't get better from here. In early 1995, Sega put its eggs all in the Saturn basket and canceled marketing completely for the Genesis and Sega CD. When this stuff starts happening, many companies will start pulling out. Like, no, I'm good. I'm out of here. They jump off the ship. It only makes sense, right? Why would you want to make a game for a dead system? By my count, and correct me if I'm wrong, tell me in the comments, there were only 21 games released for the Sega CD in 1995. 2 of these games, however, were 2 of the best games on the system, Popful Mel and Lunar Eternal Blue, which, as you likely recall from a couple of minutes ago, were Working Designs games. Working Designs, man, what a bunch of excellent folks. Despite knowing what was coming down the pipeline with the inevitable, unceremonious death of the Sega CD fast approaching, they continued to work their perfectionism and excellence into these 2 amazing games. Working Designs really did, I keep bringing up Titanic, but it makes sense, right? Working Designs really did seem to have that Titanic boat scene thing going on. Despite all other companies bailing on the sinking ship that was the Sega CD, they continued to play music on the deck, realizing that they were invested at this point and that it would be better for their fans to have these games than for them to try to pull out at the point of no return. Popful Mel released in February of 1995 and people loved it. Lunar Eternal Blue released in September of 1995 and people loved it. They definitely Hail Married or played Near My God to Thee on the deck for those 2. In 1996, as expected, Sega discontinued the Sega CD officially, with the Working Designs title Lunar Eternal Blue being one of the last games published for it. But what a way to go. I find lately that I'm painting Sega as the villain in a lot of my content, but I really do have a great respect for every video game company that I've mentioned. At least so far. It's not easy decisions to make when you're literally pioneering the video game industry. From a dude just sitting and reading or hearing about it outside of the arena, I feel like I can make quick and informed judgment calls. But I wasn't there for these decisions. I don't have the pressure on me that these executives did. I was just a young man playing video games and reading every video game magazine I could get at the time. I was just arguing the merits of Nintendo over Sega or vice versa on the playground and the bus, thinking I was being fully represented as a person by these video game companies who had no idea who I was or, who I am. So there's that. Take that with a grain of salt, all of these opinions or whatever. I do have a great amount of respect for these companies. It's awesome. Like, I appreciate the things that they did. Whatever. We learn from mistakes and we move on, right? And sometimes it makes for a great story. Sega and the Sega CD itself was indeed a sinking ship. For all of the things that were right about it, there were many more things that were wrong. And Sega seemed to be either shooting holes in the ship or at least not concerning themselves to fix the holes in it. The problem is that when companies do this, they seemingly fail to recognize how much strain it puts on the people aboard the sinking ship. For Working Designs, they were greatly affected by this. They would later republish another version of Lunar Silver Star Story and Eternal Blue, but the financial woes brought on by the blunders of Sega certainly did not help them out. That's just logic. And you can say what you want. Working Designs went on for a few years after that for sure, but it didn't help them. Imagine if these masterpieces had been on some kind of stronger system. I mean, Lunar for the PlayStation 1 did really well. But either way, Working Designs really hooked us up with some awesome games. It probably kept the Sega CD on life support longer than it needed to be. Maybe this is where the love for Working Designs comes from for so many people. They were committed to excellence in packaging, quality, titles, translations, just sort of every part of video games. They knew the assignment, some might say. Working Designs really seemed to be a company that cared about its fans, and fans became loyal to it. There are, after all, people out there who specifically just collect Working Designs games, and nearly every game with a Working Designs label on it somewhere fetches a hefty price because there are people out there looking for it. Working Designs showed us that they were willing to go down with the ship to provide us with excellent content, a dedication that eventually closed their doors. But we certainly celebrate their efforts and sacrifice in the retro video game community. Thanks, Working Designs. And thanks Sega too, of course. You know.